I've been on a bit of a Bigfoot binge of late. It turns out that I had a lot of Bigfoot-related media just lying around and that it equally happened to be stuff worth talking about on here. But when it came to today's review, 1987's Cry Wilderness, I pretty much knew exactly what I was getting into, largely thanks to those fabulous folks on the Satellite of Love. You see, Cry Wilderness was one of the first movies to be shown on the recent reboot of Mystery Science Theater 3000. In fact, it was the second episode of the comeback. And I can absolutely see why that was the case, because this thing's nuts. When I first watched it, the riffing really helped smooth over some of the drier portions, but I always had that nagging feeling in the back of my mind that seeing it unriffed would be a quite different experience. And man, I was not wrong. This one's also going to be a little on the shorter side because, honestly, there's not that much to say. Seriously, what is it with Bigfoot movies and being pretty straightforward? I need to get some real Bigfoot beef in here at some point. My kingdom for suburban Sasquatch. The film follows Paul, a young kid stuck in boarding school whose father is a hunter and ranger for a small township. Paul's obsessed with Bigfoot because, well, last summer Paul met the big-footed furry fella in the flesh, and the pair had a rather happy summer together, wandering the woods with Paul introducing Bigfoot to the treasures of capitalism. He basically gets him hooked on Coca-Cola and addicted to rock music and public talk radio. And in return, Bigfoot protected Paul and his family using his supernatural Bigfoot powers, gifting Paul a magic amulet that glows whenever he's nearby. The film picks up with Paul on a field trip to the local Natural History Museum, where he wanders off from the group to go and hang by the Bigfoot exhibit. His teacher's furious that he wandered off, but when Paul tries to explain that Bigfoot's a good buddy of his, the teacher accuses him of lying and believing in fairy tales and gives him a detention unless he's willing to admit he's making it up, which he refuses. Later on, the teacher tries again to make Paul admit he's wrong, but again, Paul refuses, leading to the teacher telling Paul he's going to have to take what's happened today directly to the principal. Bit harsh, but okay. Later that night, as Paul's about to head to bed, his amulet begins to glow and Bigfoot appears at the school to warn him that he needs to go to the woods immediately, as his father's in grave danger and will soon be dead if Paul doesn't intervene. Paul tries to convince his friends that Bigfoot's outside, but he's long gone by the time anyone can actually check, and the commotion summons Paul's teacher again, who this time pretty much tells him he's on his final warning and that he'll be expelled if this continues past this incident. It's here that we're also formally introduced to Paul's dad and his Native American friend Jim, who are currently trying to calm a town-wide bloodbath as some kind of beast is causing concern. The guys largely try to rehouse animals causing trouble, but the crowd want whatever it is dead, and the town's sheriff is inclined to agree with the people. Despite Paul's dad and Jim begging him for more time to allow them to properly track down whatever it is and relocate it, they're given one last shot to find it and stop the issue before it gets taken into the town's hands. While this is going on, Paul seemingly checkmates the situation with the school by off-screen packing his stuff and hitchhiking his way from the boarding school back to the woodlands, where he's pretty much immediately and very conveniently, given how many hundreds of miles of woodland and mountains his dad covers, is reunited with his father and Jim. What follows is an extended trek back to Paul and Jim's cabin, in which we get a few rather nice shots of woodland critters. Paul winds the fuck out of a bobcat and disappointingly doesn't get mauled, and after what feels like forever, they arrive back at the cabin to find the door open and a stranger in the house eating some kind of mystery meat and generally acting the dickhead. The guys go to investigate the kitchen and find a small army of baby raccoons. They're destroying the kitchen looking for snacks. It's a rather cuddly moment, which is interrupted when the stranger full-on manhandles one of the raccoons and the guys decide that they've had enough and that they need answers. The stranger introduces himself as Morgan, a US Marshal drafted in by the sheriff to work with Paul's dad and Jim to execute whatever it is that's causing the town trouble. And when I tell you that this guy is made out to be the most malicious bastard I've seen in a good while within a family movie, I'm not kidding. The guy's an arsehole. Paul briefly chats to Morgan and asks him about Bigfoot. Morgan says he has no reason to believe Bigfoot exists, but he becomes suspicious when Paul won't drop the questions and begins to suspect that Paul knows something. He quickly shuts up when Morgan starts asking him questions. Later that night, Paul has troubling dreams in which he's watched over by Bigfoot and he sees Morgan cracking on with some off-screen massacring. The next day, Morgan, Jim and Paul's dad head into town for a meeting with Mr. Wagner, a powerful influencer in the town and a luxury hotel owner, who bluntly announces he wants the animal's head, whatever it is, on his doorstep within 24 hours or there'll be trouble. And that's pretty much the rest of the movie. Paul and the troupe go to explore a few animal and wildlife hotspots looking for the beast. At various points they find strong evidence to suggest that Bigfoot's real, which gets Morgan even more invested in finding out about Paul's secret, and we get introduced to some colourful characters, including a wildlife conservationist who works with Jim and Paul's dad to look after captured animals until they can be rehomed. Along the way, we also meet a gnarly biker gang who've set up shop in the woods until problems they've caused have died down. This of course all builds up to a grand reveal of the beast that's been stalking the town, and a final fight to capture or kill the animal, with Paul doing everything in his power to try and run damage control to prevent his father's untimely demise. In a very pretty but very pedestrian 90-ish minute adventure in the great outdoors, will Paul save his father? Will Bigfoot get discovered? And are any of those raccoon babies going? Because I absolutely will take a couple of raccoon babies if they're up for grabs. Aww. Anyway, the rocks, the mountains and big-footed follies await if you take a chance on Cry Wilderness. And I feel the need to say this up front, but this is very much a so bad it's entertaining movie. This isn't intentionally funny, and while it may have earned a cult status since its initial release, that cult status is the same kind of cult that's led to Ed Wood's work being taken to heart. I feel the need to say that because I really liked this film because of how awkward and weird it is in places. But there's also some yawning chasms of dullness dotted throughout, and what I don't want people to do is hear me say this film's so wacky, then rush out to buy it and get disappointed that a good 40 minutes of the runtime is just shots of mountains and stock footage shots of animals wandering around the woods. It absolutely has its moments, but this isn't a good cult movie in that way. Probably the film's weakest element is in fact the script, and that's kind of on multiple levels really. On a base level, there just isn't enough actual plot to carry the movie to feature runtime. And that's not to say that there wasn't opportunity for them to make this thing feature runtime and interesting, but presumably because of time and budgetary limitations, live animals aren't cheap, what we end up with is collectively about 30 to 40 minutes of plot that's just been mercilessly dragged out to over 90 minutes. The initial plot of Paul trying to figure out and prevent his dad's death kind of gets dumped by the wayside for a decent chunk of the movie, as does anything to do with Bigfoot really. I mean, don't get me wrong, Bigfoot does turn up throughout, but quite often it's either at a distance or it's just shots of him standing there not really saying or doing anything. In fact, he only really does one physical thing that interacts with the actual movie, which I won't say here because spoilers, but the bulk of the movie's given over to the gang trying to find this mysterious beast, and well, the best way to explain that plot is that there's about 5 to 10 minutes of actual interesting plot progression going on, with the remaining 45 to 55 minutes literally just being the guys titting about in the woods, pissing off animals and talking absolutely pointless nonsense. This in turn leads to a third act that gets surprisingly gory, weird and Twin Peaksy for a lack of a better descriptive. The plot though isn't really why you come to this film. The plot is the tablecloth with which this madness sits. It's what the characters do within that space that really makes the film what it is, because it's clear that the people who wrote this had no idea how to write character dialogue and only had an absolutely basic level of understanding on how character development works, because everyone's either a good guy or a bad guy and the dialogue reads like a 6-year-old was giving a recollected account of a traumatic event. At multiple points, our cast just break out into the most awkward, stilted and pained sitcom-style laughter I've ever seen. Everyone speaks in absolutes, with the simplest lines reading in the most over-the-top ways imaginable. Our characters don't really grow or develop across the runtime, they just ramble inanely and just spew utter word salad in places. And at times it was genuinely hard to keep a track of what was going on, where people were, or what, if any, motivations our characters had. It's amazing, and literally one of the most unintentionally funny things I've seen in a good while. It's more than worth the price of admission just for that factor alone. The script is lumpy, unevenly paced, and tonally unable to pick a lane, with a chunk of the film clearly trying to be a Mac and Me style kids movie, a chunk trying to appeal to young teens who want blood and guts, and a chunk trying to get adults on board with its positive family values. The vast majority of the runtime quite literally is just shots of mountains or our characters wandering around forests, woods and streams. And I could absolutely understand why some people would get very bored very quickly with this thing, but for me, while it did drag a little on that front, the absurdity of the whole thing kept me absolutely engrossed. If you have tolerances for a little drag here and there, I'm near certain you'll have a ball with this thing. It's an ultra-campy, ham-tastic, overly dramatic concussion of a work that simultaneously annoyed me and won me over. The script was written by Philip Yordan. He has 69 writing credits and a career spanning 52 years. He mainly seems to have worked in westerns and horror thrillers, and while none of his films have jumped out at me, he apparently won an Oscar in 1955 for writing the movie Broken Lance, I think it's fair to say that this was probably not one of his finest hours. He sadly passed away in 2003 at the age of 88. The film was directed by Schlossberg-Cohen. He has 2 directing credits, this film and a segment of an anthology film called Night Train to Terror. And honestly, it's kinda hard to tell whether the root cause for the film ending up as interesting as it ultimately has is down to the script or the direction. Because the script for Cry Wilderness sits near the end of Yordan's career as a writer, and at this point he was producing a script every 2 years or so, roughly, and he seemingly hadn't written anything above meh-worthy since the mid-70s. From the way this script is structured, I get the feeling that Yordan was trying to harken back to the 50s style of family movie. Maybe with a bit more of a bigger budgeted scope behind it though, due to the changes in tech between the 50s and 80s. Cohen, by contrast, had only had partial directorial experience prior to this, and it could be levelled at him that he was trying to make a movie more in the vein of things like E.T. or Harry and the Hendersons, which also came out the same year. In either case, the two styles clash violently, and whether it's a bad script amicably directed or a decent script badly translated is probably a debate best reserved for my comments section, quite frankly. My 10 cents? I feel if this is trying to take on the 80s family movie genre, then from a directing standpoint it's a game of two halves. The actual physical direction is astounding for a proper first-time director. This film looks great in terms of getting the absolute best out of uniting all of the various departments in the goal of turning out the best possible film it could. There are sequences here that can and have put other films to shame in terms of getting the cine, lighting, location work, sound, performances to all work together in producing a solid vision. That of course isn't to say it's perfect. A few of the more abstract scenes are a little wobbly in terms of their execution. The scene where Bigfoot turns up to the boarding school at the beginning of the film is supposed to evoke an otherworldly mystery, but in actuality just looks like a guy in a Bigfoot costume stood in front of a smoke machine and some of the leftover lighting setups from Suspiria. Probably the biggest issue I have from a directorial standpoint is the director's failure to curb those excessive padded moments within the script. Those endless shots of people wandering around the woods, that's the stuff that a director should acknowledge doesn't work and should either tighten up, trim out, or figure out how to actually make it interesting, either in flight during the production, or at a minimum it should be something that's hashed out in post. Here though, I don't know if there was pressure from up top to keep the thing at 90 minutes or what, but that padding, whilst nicely maintained, is a clear marker of inexperience on behalf of the director. As for direction of the cast, the script doesn't help, but here all our main cast are basically asked to chew the scenery to pieces, to steamroll through their lines like they're laying a new highway and to emote well beyond any level of realism. With the multiple awkward laughter scenes and sequences of Morgan's border psychotic tendencies again showing a director who hasn't yet honed the ability to communicate realistic expectations of his cast. They can only give what the director asks, and the director can only get what's communicated to the actors, and I don't know what was communicated to them, but the results are mesmerisingly odd. In the best possible way, I might add. Again, it's how this has been written and directed that's absolutely the saving grace of the film, and the reason for its infamy, but that's absolutely not a good thing. Swinging violently, however, in the other direction, the cine is really quite gorgeous. It's hard to really split out what's stock footage and what's actual honest-to-God footage shot for this film, but in many ways I applaud that fact. The fact these sequences only ever really have a few tells here and there as to what's stock and what's not, and that there's actual ambiguity over what's stock and what's not, I think is actually quite impressive. There's some really solid compositional work here that rarely if ever falls flat. We have some solid attempts at blocking for about 80% of the runtime, and even in the padded moments, whoever it is they got in to do the DOP on this thing is trying their absolute damnedest to save it, by getting as much cutaway and coverage footage as possible to try and make the sequences where the gang are wandering aimlessly in the woods feel like something that isn't just time killing. I'm actually seriously impressed with this thing. The location work is colourful, vibrant, and uses a solid range of shot types and experimentation. It is some mixed results, but as always I'd rather a film that tries and fails than one that's overly safe and dull. The fact that it sincerely tries and largely succeeds in trying to create and maintain an atmosphere while also trying to keep it interesting, well, I'll call it a win in my book. The sequences are all wonderfully crafted also, with a decent editor on hand who's been able to pull together the stock footage, excellent location work and B-roll to create an end product that's floppy, but clearly trying and for the most part succeeding. Performance-wise, I've already mentioned previously that the cast seemingly weren't really given the best guidance on how to perform for this thing, but that's not to say that they weren't trying to make it work where possible. John Tallman as Jim probably gives the closest to an actual straight performance. He's fairly grounded, and barring some moments of utterly demented awkward laughter, I think he's probably the strongest legitimate performance in this. My favourite performer has got to be Griffin Casey as Morgan, who's hammy, over-the-top and utterly malicious in almost every scene he's in. He goes way extra than was required for this kind of a movie, and I really appreciated just how hard he threw himself into his character role. He's a strong reason to check this thing out. As regular viewers will know, I have my rules on discussing child actors, so I won't be going into detail about my thoughts on Eric Foster's performance, but this was his first credited acting role, and I think he handles himself well given just how demanding the role is. Tom Folks is a more than solid Bigfoot, but unfortunately the rest of the cast are kind of bland, unremarkable, and if I'm being honest, I do kind of wish they either animated more or had more of a point. But a lot of our supporting cast get 1 or 2 scenes tops and then they're never seen or heard from again, which doesn't really help to establish a connection with them. I think had they maybe involved the township a bit more, those long gulfs of awkward woodward wandering would have probably been quite improved. And finally, the soundtrack. It's decent enough. It's adventure-y sounding 80s synth. It's tonally quite fitting, with my only criticism being it maybe would have been nice to have a bit more tonal diversity in terms of the instruments used and the compositional choices. Usually films like this will do synth and something else, like synth and string arrangements, or synth and rock and roll, or synth and pop. Here it's all synth, and it's all synth that sounds kind of samey. It's not offensive, it's not really bad, I just kinda wish they'd done more with it. Cry Wilderness didn't get a UK VHS release, but it did get one in the US seemingly under Video Rondo in what I can only assume was either 1988 or 1989, it's not that clear. It then wasn't seen again until those plucky adventurers at Vinegar Syndrome picked it up, first on DVD as the B picture in a double feature set as part of their Drive-In Movies series in 2014, and then later on Blu-ray as part of their 5 Films 5 Years series, where it appeared on Volume 4 in 2018. Both of these releases have only the trailer for the film in the way of extras, which is a shame. But I guess, what do you say about this crazy thing? It kinda speaks for itself. As an aside, it also got a physical release as part of the MST3K Season 11 DVD and Blu-ray set in 2018 as well. So there are plenty of options for your wilderness fix. Though, as of the time of recording, other than the MST release, all others have now officially gone out of print. Cry Wilderness absolutely won't be for everyone. It's a fundamentally flawed film and a great example of putting the right people together on the wrong project. That misalignment on a clear vision has ultimately left it feeling like it's being pulled in 2 different directions. While the Cine is gorgeous, the direction is kind of a game of 2 halves, with the technical aspects of the direction being handled well, but the performer side of the direction being chronically poor. The performers try their best, but without proper guidance and a throwback-style script that's kind of been misunderstood, the end result is a wonderfully terrible movie that I personally have a real soft spot for. And if you enjoy cheesily bad movies, I'm sure you'll love it too. But if you like your cult cinema to have a bit of a faster pace and a bit more in the way of consistency, you may want to look elsewhere.